Hi everyone, and welcome to the next webinar in Protek's Thought Leadership webinar series. And on this webinar, we're going to be focusing on control frameworks and compliance, and particularly the bridging of the gap between compliance, frameworks, controls, risk management. Often organizations know they have to do all of this stuff, but they often have everything disconnected, which leads to duplication of effort and a lot of misunderstanding of what we're trying to do. Hopefully, we're trying to demystify some of that misunderstanding. Now, I'll get to introduce my colleague Michael first, and then I'll introduce myself, and then we'll get stuck into the webinar. So, Michael, over to you.
Thanks, David. Hello all. So I'm the Senior Manager of Research and Content at Protect. I'm a self-confessed risk nerd. Love risk and all things risk. At Protect, I look after a lot of our digital online training and also feed a lot of the research that we do into our product developments and also a lot of our blogs, webinars, and ebooks. Back over to you, David.
Fantastic, Michael. And my name's David. I'm Chief of Research and Content and also one of the co-founders of Protect. And just to make Michael sound exciting, I'm a controls nerd, which is lucky because that's what this session is all about. In terms of Protect, most of you, I'm sure, might be on your second or third webinar or even more. But for those that aren't, the name kind of gives away what we do. I, as a co-founder, am very passionate about risk controls, everything risk management, which is really the protection or protect in Protect. And my partner, David, another David, is passionate around technology and risk management, hence he's the tech. As an organization, we do four things. The first one is people and culture. We call that Protect Academy, and it's really around engaging people in risk management and educating them in terms of the knowledge they need to be able to be great risk managers. Secondly, we have automation, which is our Protect EOM system, which brings everything to life in risk management. Thirdly, we have what we call customer success or Protect Advisory, which is about embedding all of this into the business so it becomes part of the day-to-day. And lastly is the kind of the jigsaw puzzle, the glue that makes it all hang together, which is really Protect Consulting, and that is really around frameworks, risk appetite statements, all those elements of governance and so on, which sits across the whole of risk management. Now that's enough about us. In terms of what we're aiming for this webinar, firstly, how risk management controls and compliance interlink. So try and avoid seeing them as separate concepts. How do they work together? This is the real key to integrated enterprise and enterprise compliance and risk management. Number two, the value of good controls management. Thirdly, controls frameworks and controls management. This is really where compliance and controls strongly interlink, and that is the linkage between a control and its related controls framework, of which many of those aspects of a controls framework, as we're going to see, are pretty much obligations on us. How controls management and assurance should be practiced to get a little bit more practical. Also very much about ownership, roles, responsibilities, accountabilities. Who is responsible for managing and assuring controls? And finishing up with the output of what risk management and compliance is all about, which is reporting. Now, in terms of housekeeping, as we always do with these webinars, they will run for about 60 minutes. As we run through the webinar, please enter your questions into the question control panel, and we will be answering those questions by way of a blog back to you after the webinar. We will also have a post-webinar questionnaire, so please hang on right at the end there. We really value your feedback. And as we're always asked, will you have the slides and the recording available? Yes, you will. We'll send those to you together with the blog answering the questions, and you will have those available to be able to watch at your heart's content, I'm sure many times. Now, I want to get you thinking about what we're covering today. And this quote by Stephen Covey: compliance does not foster innovation, trust does. And I guess what that's really getting at is the concept of just complying. Why do we do that? Because we have to. Why do we do it? Because there's a compliance obligation. There really is no kind of value add output other than I won't get caught or I won't get into trouble. It doesn't really foster any value. Where trust in what you are doing does foster that. And trust is all about understanding how well are our operations working that we require to have in order to achieve our objectives, including innovation and our day-to-day objectives. And part of today is all about How do you build trust in your internal operations, that all of the key risks are being managed, while at the same time being able to say that you are complying with compliance obligations, including control frameworks? Now, the way we're going to address this is we've got 6 particular sessions. First of all, the drivers of control frameworks. What's driving it is particularly coming almost a lot more prominent what it was. Building compliance control bridges, this interlink between compliance and controls. Controls assurance for compliance, and that is really getting to the essence of how do we ensure controls are effective. Then the who, and then a little bit about when. Controls cadence, when should we be practicing controls management? And lastly, as we mentioned, controls reporting. So for the first one, which really sets the scene, what are the drivers of control frameworks? Well, I guess it's a good place to start is to go back and think about what exactly is a control. Because in many ways, the problems of understanding controls is what is driving the need for control frameworks. Now, to quote the ISO 31000 standard, it talks about a control as a measure that maintains and or modifies risk, which I always think is technically correct, but very difficult for a non-risk person to really understand. What does that mean? Well, it maintains or modifies a risk. What aspects of the risk does it modify? Well, the size of the risk. Now, what we generally accept as making up the size of a risk? We typically accept that it's made up of the likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact or consequence if the risk were to occur. So in terms of modifying it, a control will either modify the likelihood and or the impact consequence of the risk. So at Protect, we define a control as a specific action taken with the objective of reducing either the likelihood of the risk occurring and or the impact if the risk were to occur. Hopefully that's very similar to a lot of your definitions. Now, once we've understood what are controls, that can take us then to the next stage of what exactly is controls management. But if we think about controls management, controls, as we mentioned, is a key tool for managing risk, particularly mitigating risk by reducing the likelihood and or the impact of that risk. Now, what is risk management? Well, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So risk management must be managing the effect of uncertainty on objectives. If we link all that together, controls are a key tool for managing the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And the most important word in all of that is the last word in the second line, which is objectives. So in many ways, the management of risks and controls is a means to an end. What is the end? It is objectives management or outcome management. Now, a lot of people think about, as we're going to see in a minute, controls as a hindrance to us achieving our objectives, when if done properly, they are in fact an enabler for us to achieve our objectives. And what this gives rise to then is what are the key issues in managing the controls with respect to this management of outcomes. These are some of the key issues that we generally find in controls management. The really big one, the elephant in the room, is a lack of understanding by a lot of control owners and operators as why they do controls. Often when we ask people who own a control, operate a control, why do you do that control? They typically say, what control? I've always done it, so I better do it again. I was told to, it's in my procedures manual, so I don't get in trouble with my supervisor. And sometimes the regulator says I have to, so I better do it. And all of these are terrible answers because it really shows a complete lack of understanding from an outcome perspective of why we do controls. Not a great start. The second issue is a fact that controls management and controls are highly complex. There are many different types of controls addressing many different risks across hugely complex organizations. So the complexity of an internal controls framework can get pretty out of hand. That then doesn't really aid understanding and management. On top of all of that, we have very quick obsolescence with a lot of controls. Why do they become obsolete? Because of change in the process. If we then go from, say, a manual process to automated process, a number of controls which review and authorize the individual's activities are no longer required. Problem is they often get disconnected and we automate the process and no one tells the person who's reviewing and authorizing that they need to stop. So they become very obsolescent very quickly. In addition, with huge amounts of change in business, those controls also need to change to remain optimal. All of this leads to a little bit of a sigh from a lot of people, and the sigh ends up then with controls being neglected. Now, if we then understand the importance of controls against the management of risk and outcomes, and we realize that a lot of controls are not being managed well, what do we do about that? Well, there's kind of two ways that you can improve the management of controls. The ideal way and the altruistic kind of way is to change the culture of people, to get people to understand the importance of controls so that they are so motivated to want to do it. They get up every day, a bit like myself and Michael, and go, we can't wait to get to work so we can practice our controls. I'm sure some of you think I'm dreaming, so do I. And we try and get that as much as possible in culture. But in the interim, it's very important that we also drive good controls management with frameworks, guidelines, minimum standards. And as much as I would prefer that we did it because it's the right thing to do, I'm living in dreamland across a complex organization. So what we need to do is to move then perhaps to having some rules around controls management. Now, what exactly is management of rules? Well, we're now moving over to compliance. What exactly is compliance? It's conforming to a rule. Under ISO 37301, the International Standard on Compliance Management Systems, it talks about compliance as being meeting all of the organization's compliance obligations. Now, compliance obligations are a requirement an organization mandatorily has to comply with, as well as voluntary chooses to comply with. We typically use the words compliance requirement have to and compliance commitment chooses to. Now, where does that mean those rules can come from? It really depends the scope of your compliance management function, but they can come from external laws, regulations, codes, standards, licenses, external customers, suppliers, lenders from a legal compliance perspective, and also internal rules, policies, procedures, minimum control standards, codes of conduct. In relation to the obligations around certain controls, we tend to see them coming from the external, where we'll have external laws, regulations that says we have to have minimum controls. I think in most jurisdictions, if you are a motor vehicle driver, you'll have a requirement to wear a seatbelt. Also, those requirements can come from internal policies, procedures, and controls, and often they will link. Now, today we're going to be focusing on external standards, and they will then hopefully dovetail across to internal controls, internal procedures, and internal policies. So the best way to think about the overlap between controls and compliance initially is the fact that compliance is a way of getting an improvement in controls management, right, from a perspective of where we are not going to get it from just people having the right culture and the understanding. And also those control frameworks are a great guidance as to what a good set of controls around our specific risks would look like. Now that said, if we go back to so what about controls, why does it matter? Let's get Michael to share some recent major control failures and the importance of this from a value loss perspective. Michael.
Thanks, David. It's about the RTX Corporation. Had some major export control failures that were recently brought to light or had fines imposed. Now, this was so they were a defence contractor, so they've got some a lot of technical defence information that they retain, and it turned out that a lot of that was being shared with countries that where that should not have been shared. So they were on sanction lists where that type of sensitive information was not able to be shared. Now that's across multiple organisations in the group, so they've conglomerated and had mergers and acquisitions over a period of time. And so it's not just the individual export controls themselves, but there's also questions about did they have the right controls in place around that merger and acquisition process, because a lot of the control failures existed in the organisations that were part of those mergers and acquisitions. Now, I picked out August 2023 because this is when almost $500 million worth of penalties were imposed against various financial firms for ephemeral messaging, off-brand messaging apps where records were not being retained. So that was one particular instance, but those types of fines have been happening over the last few years where I guess people haven't been playing catch up and haven't been implementing those controls in light of some of these control failures and some of these quite public recommendations from the SEC. The New York Stock Exchange itself fined $10 million for not reporting immediately that they had a cyber breach. So the fine was recent, but that incident was back in 2021. But clearly they didn't have the right controls in place to make sure that once that cyber breach was identified, that it was reported in a timely manner. And we've reported on the Citigroup Fatfinger error previously. Go look at one of our blogs for a bit of a deeper dive, but it was $500 billion worth of trades were entered. Controls did pick up quite a number of that, and we've prevented some of that from being processed, but $1.4 billion worth of trades was still processed, which led to some material indices in the Europe markets being affected over the next several minutes. So clearly there's a lot of control failures out there that have impacted those organizations, customers, markets. So it's not just the fines themselves, but it's what is the impact, and particularly around the reputation of those organizations as well. Any comments from you, David, on any of those?
No, I think that's plenty of examples. I mean, I guess the way I see this is that if you think about the link between controls and value loss, it's not many more obvious than that. And by the way, those are only the monetary values, leave alone the reputation and brand damage. So that's why I'm a controls nerd, because controls look after us.
So if we think now about the regulatory landscape, obviously many sectors and all organisations need to comply with their obligations. They may have, particularly in financial services, there may be specific rules and regulations around having compliance management programs in place. But we're seeing a lot of regulatory drivers which are moving people more towards control frameworks, particularly around cyber, around privacy. We've got some of this listed here. I won't go through them in detail. But many of those have requirements around managing information security, managing privacy. And we've got operational resilience rules around the globe, making sure that you're managing your operations within tolerance. Now, particularly for something like privacy, cyber, some of you may be operating in multiple jurisdictions. So you've got these multiple requirements that are being imposed upon you. And the question then becomes, how do we manage those? How do we make sure that we're complying with all these obligations that may exist in different jurisdictions, which I think is then why people are turning towards some of these control frameworks. Now, here is an example of some of those frameworks. Next slide, please, David. Oh, sorry, one of the other drivers is the extended enterprise. So it's not just the regulators that are asking you to comply. We're finding that third parties, with your third parties, fourth parties, nth parties, they're all also expecting you to comply. They've got their own obligations, and perhaps by contagion, brand, reputation, they want to make sure that you're meeting your own obligations, your own compliance requirements. So the way that we currently manage that is through vendor questionnaires, having third-party assurance. But we're finding more and more there's this requirement or expectation that you might be certified against a particular framework, against a particular standard, because it makes that a little bit easier for all parties involved. And there's going back to your comment earlier, David, about trust. They then have a level of trust in your organization if you can be certified against certain frameworks. So looking at what some of those frameworks are, this is certainly not a comprehensive list, and there will be frameworks across various sectors. But some of the common ones that we see people applying, particularly around cyber and privacy, the NIST cybersecurity framework, privacy frameworks, PCI, DSS if you are processing payments. We're also seeing more and more ESG reporting standards, so the CSRD and various other reporting requirements around ESG or climate, environment in many regions. And there are a range of ESG reporting standards as well that can be applied across those different regions.
Okay, so now we're moving to building bridges. Let's think about how do we build bridges, or remove silos is another way of saying it. And I just want to stand back and think about what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with risks, controls, frameworks, compliance obligations. outcomes, how do we bring that all together? So let's go back to the fundamentals of what is risk. Now, if we take risk itself, risk is generally made up of three main parts. Firstly, the root causes of that risk, where it all starts. That then dominoes into risk events, things that then happen because that cause has kicked off. That event will often then mess up a critical process that we need to achieve our objectives, which means we'll have an impact on one or more of our objectives. And that's typically the pathway of a risk from its beginning to its end, demonstrating this uncertainty on objectives, effect of uncertainty on objectives, where those causes, events, processes are to a degree uncertain, which then leads to an uncertain impact. This is what we call inherent risk, no controls. So we now need to add our controls on. And that really highlights the 5 key components of a residual risk. Now, when we typically take a risk, we have one main event, that central event, and therefore it can have multiple causes that could lead to it, multiple processes that are impacted by it, and by definition then, or by logical conclusion, multiple objectives that are negatively impacted by it. Also, typically, we don't have just one control over a risk, we'll have several controls. And there we've now started to get the main components of residual risk. For those of you that have done this before or know Protect really well, we love to put an outline around this. And of course, that is risk bow tie analysis. And all of that shows the components of risk, and very importantly, all interlinked, connected together. And now we now go and add now compliance on. So let's now go to an external regulatory compliance requirement, such as a seatbelt in your motor vehicle, whatever. And the first thing, where does that link? Well, if we go to the right, we should have one of our objectives of any organization should be, I would put to you, to comply with applicable regulatory obligations, which means if this risk ends up with you not complying with that regulation due to a compliance breach, that's exactly where that link will come to. So the impact being impact of not complying will link to then not complying with that specific compliance obligation. Now, in addition, if we think about the seatbelt in your motor vehicle, not only would you not be complying and therefore could get a fine, but also that compliance obligation links directly to the seatbelt, i.e. in this instance, directly to that control. So we have it really linked to two parts. One is the impact on our objectives, not complying. And secondly, it also links to the control itself, the need to have that in place. If we think about those regulatory obligations, they really represent minimum control standards in order to meet the risk appetite of society. And that risk appetite of society is manifested to us by the need to have certain controls in place, but also the need to meet certain requirements such as speed limits. Now, this is where compliance in its true form, regulatory compliance and risk management overlap. Now we add the standards compliance, and particularly a framework compliance of a control framework. Now, with the control framework, that control framework might specifically address the need to have over this risk these 3 controls. So we've now got a linkage between the control framework and the controls. What's really important here is that we now could just say we're going to do the controls in order to comply, but that's extremely short-sighted. Because unless the law is pointless, the regulation is pointless, and the control framework is pointless, you'd hope that that risk control, is also addressing one of your key risks. So you have both parts. You have a control helps you comply, but B, most importantly, it helps you to address a risk that you face. And what's interesting here is that often organizations will choose to comply with the control framework because they think it's good practice, such as ISO 27001, and then they will start advertising and saying, we comply with ISO 27001, so they are representing to the outside world they comply. People might rely on that, and they might then take them on as a supplier, and in many ways that moves the control framework to become an obligation. You are now obligated to address that. Now that might sound quite complicated, all of that. If it is, I'm sorry, we're just the messengers, we didn't invent all this. But what's important here is this should underlie your framework of risk management, controls management, and compliance management. So it's not siloed, it's linked. So to bring this to life with an example, let's take a very small risk, I'm joking, of cyber intrusion. If we just map this out using practical example, I won't do each step individually, I'll do it all in one go. We'll look at the left-hand side, tracing back to examples of root causes. I'm not going to repeat these, you can read them in your own time. We then link cyber intrusion to our objectives down the right side, and we've got our inherent risk. We now add a series of controls in place, and we've got our classic residual risk. If we now add in obligations, compliance, the first one will take our external regulatory compliance, privacy obligations. And as we can see there, we've got a direct link to breach of privacy obligations, compliance breach on the right. In addition, we'll bring ISO 27002 in, and I'm only going to link it to one of the controls, although it links to more than one. But just to illustrate this, and we've now got a linkage between 27002 and authentication. Now, hopefully that brought it to life about building bridges, or should we say building linkages. And this is very important in order to get a really strong and efficient enterprise-wide controls, compliance and risk management framework. So the focus of today's webinar is really controls against frameworks. So Michael, what exactly are control frameworks?
Thanks, David. We've used the term authority documents. You might have a slightly different view, but we've used that term as something that people generally in the market will see as being something that is worth striving for. Usually they're quite structured. We've got a bit of a structure here around that. They may have various different levels in that structure, but allows organisations something to follow in order to be able to adopt what is considered good practice around controls. So commonly they will have some commonly implemented or expected controls within a particular risk domain or area. They may actually include the minimum standards that might be required or expected in order to meet the minimum requirements of that particular framework. But what we have found is that many organisations want to start mapping, and we'll get a little bit more detailed into mapping to multiple frameworks later, but many of these frameworks will have different kind of structures. They may have different levels or different ways that they classify things. We want to be able to link them all to our enterprise control frameworks and libraries, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail a little bit later. But here's our example of ISO 27002, sort of as an example of that structure in that particular framework, and then being able to map the requirements of that framework to the individual controls. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. So to move on from here, let's start looking at how we can do controls assurance for compliance. Now, I'm going to start at quite a high level to begin with, and then we'll delve into some of the depths here. So when you're looking at implementing a test plan, let's start with that. How are you going to implement a test plan for your compliance obligations? Well, the first step is just to identify which of the compliance obligations that require the assurance. Now, not all obligations are equal. Yes, you might want to comply with all of them, but some are going to be more important than others, as we showed through some of the control failures breaches that we explored earlier. Now, some of those might be regulatory obligations directly. Some of them could be obligations you want to be able to demonstrate to your third parties, or it might just be that you want to identify that you are compliant with one of these frameworks that we've just covered. Now, the next step is then to identify what are the key controls that need to be tested in order for you to meet those obligations or demonstrate you are meeting those obligations. You then need to move into scheduling the actual testing itself, which might be used through systems and automation. Then there's the actual ongoing testing itself by the people on the ground, or there may be some automation. Once you are testing those controls, you'll identify potential weaknesses, potential issues that you then need to take action on. And finally, as David mentioned earlier, reporting at the end to be able to provide that assurance to the key stakeholders. So that's at a high level, this controls management or controls assurance process. David, let's dive in a little bit deeper into the actual ongoing testing of a control. How do we go about testing those controls?
Yeah, fantastic. And I think the key to this is when we talk about testing, we are trying to get objective evidence as to the level of effectiveness of the controls. Now, the word effective can be used in many forms, but effective has to be assessed against a certain standard. And that standard needs to be, number one, the control objective. So the starting point for good controls testing, good controls assurance is to get very clear on what the control objectives are. You are then testing the degree to which the control actually meets the control objective. Now, as we're going to see in a minute, we will give you some outlines about how to come up with good control objectives. But by and large, going back to one of my earlier slides, a lot of people, when asked what's the objective of the control, they have no idea. My objective is so I don't get into trouble. It's not good enough. So we'll come to that. Once you've identified the control objective and that sets the line in the sand as to what we're assessing effectiveness to, we then really assess the control in terms of two parts. Number one is design effectiveness. Now, this is the best that the control can be. It can never be better than how it's been designed. And this then straight away might mean that we say the control is less than effective, because if we believe its design cannot meet in any way all of the control objectives, we have some kind of issue or weakness. Now, once we've done design effectiveness, within the limitations of the design, we then go and test how well is it actually operating. And this is saying how well is the control actually operating in the business right now in managing that risk and meeting that compliance requirement. So with that said, as I mentioned, a lot of organizations really struggle with defining their control objectives. So at Protect, we came up with our own design of a template or a way of thinking about control objectives. We'd like to share it with you, and hopefully you can get something out of it in the absence of you having something yourself. So Michael, why don't if you could just take us through that example of a control objective?
Absolutely. So I'll go through a high-level guide about how to structure it, and then we'll use an actual example. So to begin with, you want to think about what is the control type? What is the control actually doing? Which really makes you think about, think about that bow tie. How does it actually prevent, detect, react? You may have different words: deter, correct. There may be a few different words you might use, but what is the control actually doing to the risk? Then you look at the risk itself. Which risk, or perhaps risks, is that particular control influencing? And then finally, how is it actually managing that risk? Is it reducing the likelihood, or is it reducing the impact? Perhaps in some cases, it can be both. And then that's about the risk. Now, there may also be a requirement to comply with applicable obligations. So that could be a particular regulation, could be a framework. As a seatbelt is a really good example that David used earlier. Now, so that's the high-level template. Now let's actually bring that to life with an example. We looked at multi-factor authentication in the cyber intrusion bow tie that David used before. So if we use the control type, it is to prevent, and then we look at the risk. It is to prevent the risk of unauthorized access to systems and data. And then what is it actually intended to do? How is it doing that? So as to reduce the likelihood of that risk occurring. And finally, in the example that we used, we also aligned it with ISO 27002. It is to comply with that section 8.5 of ISO 27002. So to prevent the risk of unauthorized access to systems and data so as to reduce the likelihood of that risk occurring, and to comply with ISO 27002. Now, when we pull together and you think about the bow tie and the template that we've used here, we find it is rare, if ever, that a control objective should not only be to comply. A seatbelt exists. Yes, there is a requirement that you have to have it, but it's also reducing the impact if an accident was to occur. So if you aren't using a template like this, or maybe you currently have templates which are to comply with Regulation X, now might be a time to rethink and consider how you might actually be able to test controls. Because if that is your objective of your control, it's a bit hard to really think about the design effectiveness. Or maybe the design effectiveness is the minimum standard, not the best way to manage the risks that your organization faces. So David, if we've got the control objective and we do have it well articulated, how do we then use that to assess the design effectiveness?
Perfect. So once we've got that, we then move on to how well is the control designed. Now, straight away, we reference the objective, which is the why. So when we think about how do we assess design effectiveness, we need to address the why, the what, the who, the when, the how, and finally the value. Why we've already covered. What is the actual evidence of the control? What is required to evidence that control? Is there some kind of documentation? Is there some kind of record, digital or otherwise, that the control has actually taken place? Who is the control operator and owner? Are they of their sufficient seniority and skill and training. What's the cadence? When should the control operate? And that is both in terms of timeliness and also frequency. For example, where you are addressing a high velocity risk, one that moves from cause to impact very quickly, you'd expect a lot higher frequency of that control operating than one that's got a very, very slow velocity. How does the control actually operate? So we get into a bit more detail of what does it actually do. If it's a detective control, where does it capture the data which it's going to use to detect? How is it going to analyze that data to come up with an exception? What level of threshold will it use to maybe trigger an alert? So how does it actually operate? And also lastly, what is the cost benefit of the control? And that is an overriding requirement for design, because if the cost of the control is greater than the cost of the risk which it addresses, it's maybe not overly useful, and we've reduced the risk to below what is reasonably practicable. Now, sitting behind all of these, there are a whole bunch of detailed tests you can do. Many years ago, when I wasn't that busy, that's not been for a while, I sat down one day and come up with as many factors of a control I could think of that would affect its design effectiveness. And it came out about 60 different items. Right, now I'm not going to share those with you. They're a bit overwhelming, but they can be divided pretty much up into the why, the what, the who, the when, the how, and the value. And once we've got design, we can say how well is the actual control designed with respect to its objective. I'll give an example in a second. We then move over to operating effectiveness, which is how well is the control actually operating. Now, in this instance, we now take the why, the what, the who, the when, the how, and we say, how is it actually happening rather than how it's designed to happen? So is the control objective understood by the operator and the owner? When you ask them, why do you do that control, you get because I was told to, which isn't going to give you a good comfort that the control is operating well. Is the control evidenced as it should be? Is the control owner and operator who they should be? Right? Do they meet the design criteria for them? Is the control actually performed according to when it should be or when it's designed to be performed, and the frequency? And has the control actually been operated as required? If we take a very simple example of this, if we took something like an external perimeter CCTV camera, right, using Michael's approach to objectives, and I won't dwell on this, we could say that the external CCTV camera is there to be able to deter, detect, and to react to the risk of unauthorized access into your building, so as to reduce the likelihood and the impact of that risk occurring, and to comply with XXX obligation if you have any regulations around the need to have CCTV cameras, or it relates to a particular control framework that you are required or you are referencing. Once we've done that, we then have the control objective. We would then do the design effectiveness. We would take one of the cameras out of the box, we take a good look at it, and we do, and it's a big white tube with big letters down the side. CCTV camera, we are watching you, watch out. It's got a big lens on the front, a wire out the back, looks pretty good. We open up the back of it and there is no equipment in it as designed. So a quick assessment against the objective. To what degree does it deter? Pretty good. We'll give it 10 out of 10 for that. Detect, 0, because it's got no camera. And to react, 0, because no camera and no record of that film. So we don't know who's taken our, who's intruded to be able to deal with them. Right, now, if we've done all of that, it's very likely that it also has not complied with the relevant control framework. So it's pretty abysmal. So you might say at this stage it's ineffective in terms of design effectiveness. Now, you would unlikely go on to operating effectiveness until you fix the design, but just for effect, if you say it only meets the deterrent, you would then go and do operating effectiveness and you go and check a camera out. You find it 2 meters or 2 yards up a wall, and you find that it's got a little bit of damage on the side, that a tree branch has started to grow across it. Now, remember, you're only assessing the degree to which it's acting as a deterrent, because the rest of it has been eliminated by design weaknesses. And you decide that because of the branch growing across it, it can't be seen very well. So you give it about a partially effective rating for operating effectiveness. So we've got ineffective design effectiveness, and we've got partially effective operating effectiveness. And using this very simple matrix here, which is a very common one, we would end up with this control overall effectiveness being ineffective, which is probably logically the right answer, taking you through that logic. That's a very simple example of how those elements hang together. Now, once you design or decide what you're going to test, you've got to come up with your types of tests that you're going to do. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this, but basically we recognize, 6 or 7 different kind of test types typically, and that goes from walkthrough, which is really going through the whole control from beginning to end, reperforming the control. All of these are high effort, but they give you high assurance, all the way down to a simple inquiry or an attestation. Did you do the control? Yes, I did. Minimal effort, but it doesn't give you that great amount of assurance. When you design your test plans, you have to design what is the right balance between effort and assurance. Now, what's really interesting, as we move to more automation and we move to more continuous automation of control testing, we're starting to see obviously the value of the ones higher up the list going up, because they're automated. They are a lot quicker and less costly to actually test. So we're progressively seeing automated testing adding a lot of value to the efficiency of these different test results. Now, Michael, I guess one of the things we always find is kind of testing challenges with clients. It's not the easiest thing to do. So maybe take us through a few of those challenges.
And perhaps I might reflect on my own experience early in my career, a couple of learnings. One in particular is this assessing historical compliance. I was doing what I thought was some pretty awesome tests, and not to say they weren't useful, but what I quickly realized is that I was only testing whether we had been compliant in the past. It wasn't providing assurance over the future. So one of the challenges is to make sure that you're providing assurance moving forward that controls are going to be effective. I also find that some people have inconsistencies when they're applying that testing. Now, part of that could be around control objectives. If they're not well articulated, then people have to make assumptions about what that control is there to do, meaning that for the same person, they might have a different rating on a different day. Something that they tested today, next week they test it might be a little bit different. And you might find the same between different testers. So maybe individual testers are providing the same results, but someone might be rating them a little bit more harshly. Resourcing can be an issue. It's always not possible to test all the controls. And there may also be duplication that we're seeing. Now, in terms of the ways that some of those challenges can be solved, or some solutions that we see, firstly, as David talked about, well-defined control objectives can solve a lot of those inconsistencies. Same with applying consistent taxonomies, risk-based approach to address some of the resourcing or the inability to do all the controls, really focus on those key controls. Testing templates can also help with some of those inconsistencies. We're starting to see more automation around setting up control test templates and then scheduling them on a regular basis to make sure that people are using those same controls. David has covered controls and controls testing automation, which also addresses the resourcing. But I want to move to the control mapping and how we can link to multiple frameworks. So one thing that we're seeing people look towards is, how can I make sure that I can map to more than one framework at once? So here is our basic framework structure. And if we take some of the requirements, there is a bit of a mapping exercises, which can be quite painful at times, but to look at how can we map this requirement from one framework to another framework. And we're seeing this most particularly in cybersecurity and information security frameworks, particularly because for organizations that are working multinationally, some people want to see the NIST cybersecurity framework, some want to see alignment with ISO 27001, and different people have different expectations across their extended enterprise. So we are seeing a lot more effort putting into this mapping process. Now, once you have mapped some of those frameworks, one of the key benefits is then being able to link a control from your own framework to one of those frameworks, and by definition can then map across those multiple frameworks. As long as you're applying, some of those will have slight differences, so long as you're mapping to the same or the most common criteria or the most strict criteria, you can then potentially say that you're mapping to all of those frameworks. The other benefit then is that you can do the testing once and you remove some of that duplication. You test once against the one control, you do the one test, and then you're mapped against all of those frameworks, really freeing up a lot of those resources if you're doing a lot of that testing. Now, finally, Protect, we love a control taxonomy. using your own control taxonomy can then help you identify which particular frameworks you're aligning to, especially where you have one control in your library that is duplicated multiple times across different systems, different services, different processes that all have to then roll up to that one requirement within those frameworks. So we're seeing that alignment between frameworks and taxonomies really helping with that reporting and aggregating and ultimately providing that level of assurance. Back over to you,
And
David.
Michael, I think the key when you were saying that, comes to my mind is, killing 5 birds with one stone, and the efficiency to be able to do that. The issue is to line up the birds in the sight of the stone, and that is the linkages. And as obviously you're very well aware, Michael, that's a huge amount of work we've been doing in our Project ARM system to do exactly this. And very excited soon to be able to release that, which will be fantastic to see. A lot of efficiency to come from that. So now we're going to move over to the roles and responsibilities for controls management in the way that we've been talking about. Now, most of you will be familiar with the Institute of Internal Auditors Global Institute 3 lines model. Just to reiterate, to really highlight where controls management should take place. We always think about the 3 lines model in terms of managing risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So it all starts with us building a framework and a governance framework that allows us to manage the effect of uncertainty on objectives. I often use the example of going out for a walk because you want to make yourself feel mentally and physically better. There's your objective. You look up and there's a big dark cloud above you. It looks like it's going to rain. That represents risk on your objectives of feeling good. What might we do? We might go out and take with us an umbrella. Now, those raindrops represent different risks that impact on our organisation, and the umbrella represents our internal control framework, and it's the first point that those risks are managed. As we know, that umbrella may leak. We're going to get wet. Well, maybe not yet, because we have the second line, and the second line is risk management, which is aimed at reviewing and challenging the owners of the first umbrella to make sure that that frontline internal control system is working really effectively, review and challenge. If they fail, we still don't get wet, not yet, is we have our third line, which is internal audit, to provide independent assurance that the other 2 lines are working effectively. If they fail, sure enough, you are going to get wet, and we have the failure of our objectives. So to summarize that, where should controls be managed? In line 1, which is by the majority of people that do not have the word risk or control in their title, and they think controls are someone else's job. And this is the majority of your employees. That's where the control management should take place, and they are the owners. Review and challenge, line 2, they are not responsible for the controls management directly. They may do some of their own controls management work to do review and challenge. And lastly, audit, that's not where we rely on from controls assurance, but they may do some testing, but with the objective of providing independent assurance on the other 2 lines working effectively. So we've just been talking about the lines. So Michael, whose line is it anyway?
So as you said, primarily line 1 is where a lot of this control testing should be done. So if we move down to, I guess, a bit more granularity with some of these roles and responsibilities, you may have a control owner who is separate from the control operator. So the control owner is responsible for or accountable for making sure the control is performed, which might be different from someone who is actually performing it on a regular basis. Now, control testing, as David said, line 1 should really be doing their own control testing. If that's currently sitting with your line 2 teams and your line 2 teams only, then I would suggest that you need to be shipping that closer to line 1. Now, line 2 and line 3 can do some control testing, can identify improvements and maybe suggest improvements. I know some people have very black and white approaches to independence, but if they're making suggestions on how to improve design, I see that as being an okay approach. However, those people who are identifying those improvements should not be implementing those improvements on behalf of line 1. The business needs to own their controls, including improving them if they are ineffective or weak. And finally, the boards or committees will have to then oversee that whole controls assurance. Like, are these controls effective, and is the assurance, are we getting the right level of assurance that these are being done, and why do we have that level of assurance, which we'll get to in a little bit around reporting.
Thank you, Michael. And second to last, we just want to touch upon the when. What should be the frequency of controls management, controls testing, and so on. But when you think about the scheduling of the frequency of your control test, the first one is what is the minimum requirements? And that is really going to be whether you've got any obligations around your control testing. So for example, certification, you might be certified to 27001 to NIST and so on, and you've got a frequency of that certification. That is going to be your minimum. You might have contractual agreements with certain third parties that you have to do it on a certain frequency, and you might have an annual compliance plan internally you have to meet. So that is really the minimum standards. However, we must always remember that controls are there to manage risk. So once a year might not be adequate. You might have some risks that are very dynamic, right? And also some controls that are absolutely critical that they are working effectively. And once a year isn't cutting it in order to get assurance that it's working effectively. As a result, you should now take a risk-based approach and think about such things as which are the key controls. They need more testing and more frequent than non-key. What's the difference between inherent and residual risk? To what degree are you relying on those controls to reduce your risk to an acceptable level? And also aligning to your risk assessment cadence, your RCSA as it's sometimes called, because that then links to what is the effectiveness of my controls. Now, the key also is then scheduling the resourcing. How long will each of your tests take? If they are manual testing, it's going to take a lot more than automated. When are they scheduled, and what capabilities do you have to do testing? I'll leave you with this. So much as Michael's outline really should be testing their own. One of the big problems we have is the knowledge. The knowledge to be able to do control testing isn't often there, so they need to be educated up and trained up. And we sometimes do see the existence of a controls office, which is a line one office, but they've got the specialists who understand how to test controls. And Michael, I'll be passing over to you for the little comment on RCSA, old and new approaches, and then we'll move on to reporting.
So there are, I guess the old approach to RCSAs has been, as David kind of implied, a bit more of an annual or a regular frequency, but it's a single point in time. And we've also seen quite often that risk and control self-assessments are done on a business unit level or a division unit level. We're not necessarily looking across the whole organisation. Sometimes siloed from other control testing or other assurance, and perhaps not standardised. We are starting to see a bit more of a dynamic approach, which is where more dynamic control testing comes in and informs risk and compliance on a more regular basis, not just a point in time and then leave it until next year. So what we're seeing is more standardized libraries around taxonomies, particularly around operational resilience rules. We're seeing people think about doing their risk profiles and risk assessments on a more end-to-end service or value chain basis. And I think that's particularly important for compliance, where perhaps for a particular compliance domain, say anti-money laundering, individual divisions might be doing their little bit around anti-money laundering, but is anyone looking across the whole organisation or the whole service end-to-end value chain? And David's mentioned leveraging other assurance activities, integrating information from other risk processes, things like KRIs, key control indicators, various other elements of your risk and compliance frameworks that you can bring together to be a lot more dynamic and use some of those to be a bit more trigger based. So rather than just doing things on a particular cadence, using other data points to then say, actually, maybe we've got some information here that suggests we should do this a little bit earlier, or we've already got some level of assurance. Let's leave that one and reprioritize the compliance plan that we're delivering. I think we're seeing a lot more dynamic approaches starting to come into play a lot more, which brings us to controls reporting, which allows some of that dynamic or dynamism to come into play. So we see three main ways or main purposes for reporting our project. So the first is to provide that assurance, and that's really what we've been covering today. Controls assurance: are you aligned with the framework? Are your risks being managed effectively? Are you meeting all of your compliance obligations? Now, the flip side to that is to provide warnings. Here is somewhere where we may have a control weakness, or we may not be complying, something that we need to address. And thirdly, to assist in better risk-reward decision making. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of very brief things that we're thinking about at Protect when it comes to reporting. Now, here's just a brief example of a high-level controls dashboard. One thing we're starting to get a bit more demand for is, am I complying or am I aligned with particular frameworks? So looking at, particularly if you have multiple frameworks, being able to look at your overall control frameworks, but also then being able to apply at a framework level. How are we aligning with this particular framework? Can I go out to the market and say that I'm aligning with a secondary or tertiary framework that I've been working towards? So this can provide great insights to compliance teams or particular risk domains. Now, moving towards assurance itself, we can start looking at the cadence of the controls that we have tested, and also not just is the control itself effective, but where we have ineffective controls, how is that shifting our risk profile? So here we're demonstrating what are the particular risks that we need to be worried about where we don't have effective controls. So this should be a trigger warning to say, do we need to do something to fix that, the design of some of these controls to make sure that these high level risks are being mitigated as quickly as they possibly can. Next slide, thanks, David. Now, one thing we've talked about is this aggregated risk profile. So this is taking that RCSA as being one particular way that we can think about it, but also making it more dynamic and bringing in all these data points into a single aggregated risk profile. Next slide, thanks, David. So we look at this in different ways. We have a concept at Protect that we call in motion, where we take a particular element of a risk framework or a compliance framework and then think about what does that look like in motion. So the previous one was about compliance, and here we're looking at it from a risk management perspective. So this provides a bit of insight into how we're thinking about bringing together a lot of this risk data and making it more actionable for the people in your organization, making sure that they've got the assurance that their controls are effective, they're aligned with frameworks, and that the risks are being managed effectively, and that people can take the action that they need to take. Any comments from you, David, before we move to conclusions?
No, other than, I guess, for us as a firm, this integration and kind of integrated dynamic profile is the holy grail, and I guess something we've been working for a long time, and it really does highlight the importance of linkages, data points, and we showed earlier about the linkages. Those linkages are critical to be able to report this information in this integrated way, and that's why getting that framework of linking, particularly compliance with controls, with risk and so on, is so important. So no, thank you, Michael. So we're just going to move to a conclusion, and I guess from my perspective, what's the main takeout from this session? Well, I would have to say, with everything I've done in risk management, managing controls is one of the hardest things I've ever done. That probably is followed equally, if not probably slightly ahead, is managing compliance. They've given me more grey hairs than probably anything I've ever done, and we're talking about both of them together. So welcome to a really quite complicated area. That said, we see it as a firm as a wonderful way to utilize technology to be able to cut through a lot of these difficulties and let the technology do the hard yards behind the scene, and for us to then get great information out of the other end, which we can then go and use. So that would be my my main takeaway. Michael, final comment, and then we'll wind up the webinar.
I think we'll go back to our opening quote on trust. It's all about trust. I think particularly if you're aligning to some of these frameworks, how can you demonstrate that effectively? Again, not just to comply with minimum standards, but to provide that level of trust and allowing the extended enterprise into that circle of trust, as it were.
Absolutely. So thank you, everyone. We just wanted to share with you our Knowledge Centre. If you like what you've just heard and generally the way we deliver our risk information, please go to our Knowledge Centre. There's a lot more webinars, past webinars, many of them, all on different risk-related topics. We have our ebooks there as well. We have our blogs there and other information you might find very, very useful. So feel free to reach out to us as well. Before we do close though, I just want to get Michael just to share something we've been working on the last couple of years, which is very exciting for us, Michael, and then I will bring out us all to a close.
Thanks, David. As you mentioned right at the top, it's about people and culture and changing people's behaviours when it comes to risk management. So our Protect Academy does include a range of courses, some of which are very pertinent to our topic today. Controls design and assurance, we have a course specifically designed around that, as well as compliance and compliance risk management, so we can see how to bring those two things together. We have also, you can just go to our website using the QR code here and purchase those courses individually if you're individually interested in some of those, but we have also recently launched some subscription models for organizations. So if you are looking for to roll out risk or educate your people in risk across the organization, our foundation subscription is for you. And if you've got a risk team that you want to be upskilled more specifically in things like controls and assurance, then the professional subscription might be for you. So if those are of interest to you, please reach out.
Thank you, Michael. And that brings us to the thank yous. And first of all, a big thank you to all of you who've taken an hour out of your day. We hope you got a good return on your investment on a topic that, as I said, is very close to our hearts and not the easiest one to get your head around. And secondly, thank you, Michael, for contributing to that. It's one of those topics I don't like doing on my own. I get a little bit muddled and I feel very tired afterwards. So you really helped that and I appreciate it. If I could just ask all of you just to spend a minute or so to doing the post-webinar kind of questionnaire feedback form. That's really valuable to us. And yes, you will get a communication from us, which includes the materials, the video, and also the blog for any questions that you might ask. Other than that, have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are, and hopefully see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.